Welcome to the Arizona Civics Podcast and our series, Understanding State and Local Government, a 10-part mini-lecture series exploring Arizona's history, governance, and civic life. This podcast is designed to provide clear, engaging insights into topics like judicial selection, tribal sovereignty, and direct democracy. Our content expert, Dr. Sean Bienberg, a Phoenix native and scholar of state and federal constitutions, brings deep expertise to this series. Dr. Bienberg serves as the Associate Director of ASU's School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership and is the Director of the Center for American Civics. He is also author of Prohibition, the Constitution, and States' Rights, as well as Progressive States' Rights. Let's dive into the systems and stories that shape Arizona's civic life.
One of the sharpest differences between the U.S. Constitution on the one hand and that of many states, including Arizona, is that the United States Constitution creates what is called a unitary executive, which is to say that there is a single head of the entire executive branch to whom all of the rest of the executive branch is supposed to report. By contrast, Arizona, like pretty much all of the states, uses what is called a plural executive, which creates effectively a set of complementary figures but who are not in a single chain of command. So sometimes people think that unitary executive means that the US president has a vast sweep of power. But the idea of unitary versus plural executive doesn't really have anything to do with how much power is wielded. It has to do with accountability and a chain of command. So the theory behind a unitary executive, as Alexander Hamilton discusses in Federalist 70, is that particularly if we think that the executive branch's primary obligation is to enforce and execute the law rather than to make policy, that you want that to be cleanly and sort of clearly accountable whether that policy is being executed well or not. That you want basically slow deliberation in deciding what the policy is. That's why you have many people in the legislature. But once that decision has been made, it should be implemented efficiently, cleanly, and quickly. So this is Hamilton's argument for a unitary executive, that if the people see bad administration, they know exactly who to blame. The president can't just simply say, well, my Secretary of Treasury is incompetent. Well, the president has the ability to fire the Secretary of the Treasury under a unitary executive theory. So everybody is ultimately working for and accountable to the president, and therefore the president is ultimately clearly accountable to the people. The theory behind a plural executive is that you may want to, in fact, distribute your responsibility a little more broadly than that. So Arizona operates under a much different system. So whereas there is a single election effectively distributed among the states, obviously, for the president, Arizona separately elects its different members of the executive branch, with the exception of the lieutenant governor that's being implemented in 2026, which will run on a ticket with the governor. But the other statewide offices, the Secretary of State, the Attorney General, the State Treasurer, the Superintendent of Public Instruction, these are all separately elected. And the idea behind this is not only does it distribute more power, that they have different, some sense, responsibilities rather than that clear chain of command to a single executive, but it also lets voters choose specific officials for different institutional roles. So, for example, one may prefer, say, a progressive Democrat as the superintendent of public instruction, but a conservative Republican for attorney general. A plural executive lets citizens basically choose that more sort of complicated arrangement, whereas the structure of the unitary executive is effectively going to be one set of aligned people all the way down. It also allows particularly the separation of the attorney general from the president, allows the attorney general to more aggressively investigate wrongdoing by the chief executive. This is why even some of the states that use much more similar to a unitary executive will make the attorney general separately elected as sort of one particular check. Because one of the problems of a unitary executive is that it makes it much more difficult to investigate wrongdoing by the chief executive if the chief executive can simply fire the attorney general. So that's the trade-off there. The difference between the plural and the unitary executives, it's not obvious that one system is better, but they simply are making different values that they're choosing to prioritize in terms of trade-offs. So the unitary executives, again, advantages are that it is a clear line of responsibility. There is no real meaningful opportunity for infighting among the executive branch. Everybody ultimately reports to the president. A plural executive, again, has the advantage of distributing a little more power and having an additional check on the governor, but it has serious drawbacks as well. Who do you blame, for example, if the governor and the superintendent of public instruction are pointing fingers at each other for the implementation of parts of, say, a state statute on school policy, right? So there's a much more possibility of infighting, disagreement, and inefficiency. So this way, strikingly, although the Arizona Constitution tends to prioritize efficiency as one of its highest goals, the construction of its executive and its choice to use a plural executive, in fact, is one of the places where it seems to take the opposite trajectory and wants to be more cautious about diffusing power and making sure that the citizens are able to directly control things. That's the same, but the diffusion of power is quite different. So one thing that's quite striking is that governors arguably wield more power in the state than the president does at the federal level. And this partly has to do with the different obligations of the state versus the federal government. In terms of the state, again, has a much stronger presumption of authority for health, welfare, safety, and morals versus the federal government's more confined limits. One place that we saw this very concretely and specifically was during COVID, with the ability of governors to wield vast emergency powers in terms of changing policies, changing protocols at the state level that the president simply doesn't have. Now, to be clear, those powers are delegated to the governor by state statutes. This isn't simply the governor's sort of usurping power and claiming it, but in the constitutional and statutory structure of the states, governors do have a lot more discretionary power in many ways than the president tends to. So as alluded to a minute ago, Arizona is actually switching to having a lieutenant governor, which has been traditional for most states to have. Arizona instead has used its Secretary of State to sort of fill the dual hats of what a Secretary of State would do, but also to succeed the governor when the governor leaves office, which has actually been relatively common in the last 45 years in Arizona politics. Several secretaries of state have ascended to become the governor, whereas in other states, this would have been the lieutenant governor. So particularly because this often, by virtue of, again, the separate elections, would result in a party switch. So somebody, maybe the state of Arizona had said, we want a governor that's of a particular party, but a secretary of state that's the other party. Well, if the governor would leave office, this would result in a party switch and sort of a significant shift in policy. And so the thinking was that the lieutenant governor, like again in other states, should be running on a ticket with the governor so that people sort of can be confident that the same agenda, policies, perspectives that they had elected as governor will remain in office until the next session, rather than the governor being appointed to, say, the United States cabinet or become a U.S. senator or whatever it would be. And now you have a suddenly sharp shift in the governing agenda of the state, even though the citizens had never really voted for that. So in 2022, the Arizona legislature put an proposed amendment on the ballot in 2022 that means that in the 2026 election, Arizonans will begin to be able to vote for a joint ticket of a governor and a lieutenant governor. So in this sense, it's more or less the equivalent of how the United States Constitution has the vice president and the U.S. president on the same ticket after the 11th Amendment. So it creates effectively the same model that we saw there.
Thank you for joining us. This series is brought to you by the Center for American Civics at ASU, where we're working to make Arizona a national model for civic education. Special thanks to our content expert, Dr. Sean Byenberg, for his insights. Follow us on social media to stay connected and share your thoughts. We are on social media at ASU Civics on pretty much every platform. Don't forget to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Stay curious, stay engaged, and keep learning.